They were 40 minutes late. Two landing craft were already gone, and in front of them stood a 100-foot cliff under enemy fire. If these men failed to climb it, the guns above would tear Omaha and Utah Beach apart. This is the true story of Pointe du Hoc. At 07:10 on 6 June 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder hit the beach under Pointe du Hoc as two landing craft were already gone. 34 years old, commander of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, soaked to the skin in staring up at 100 feet of wet cliff while German grenades and rifle fire came down like hail, and every minute late meant 655mm guns might already be chewing Omaha and Utah into red surf. The sea was loud enough to drown thought. Landing craft slammed into the chop and then into the sand with a jolt that threw men against one another, steel helmets knocking, rifles banging into ribs. Salt water surged over the gunnels as the ramps dropped. Rangers spilled into it in clumps, some waist-deep, some suddenly over their heads because Normandy's seabed didn't care about maps. Packs dragged at shoulders, rope coils, Bangalore torpedoes, ammunition, canteens, and steel tools turned a man into a weighted object the ocean could claim in seconds. A ranger tried to stand, and the surf punched his legs out. He went down hard, face first, the water instantly filling his mouth with brine and grit. He came up coughing, eyes burning, and forced his feet back under him. Around him, men were already moving toward the cliff base like a reflex, because hesitation here wasn't fear, it was death by exposure. Above them, Pointe du Hoc rose like a wall, scarred limestone, wet with spray, nearly vertical in places. It was not a hill, it was a barrier designed by nature and refined by German engineers into a firing platform between two invasion beaches. If the guns up there existed where Allied reconnaissance said they existed, they could rake both Omaha and Utah. This mission was not to plant a flag, it was to remove artillery. Rudder's force had been scheduled to land at 6:30. They were 40 minutes late. In amphibious warfare, 40 minutes was an eternity. 40 minutes was enough time for a battery to range the beaches. Enough time for commanders offshore to wonder whether the Rangers were dead. Enough time for the enemy to reset after bombardment and point rifles down at the surf line where Americans would have to climb with ropes. At sea level, the Ranger assault fractured into immediate problems. One section fought to haul gear from a half-swamped craft. Another tried to drag a ladder over the side without losing it to the surf. Another still tried to keep men from clustering and becoming a perfect target. Rudder stood with his boots in water that tugged at his ankles and watched his battalion begin the climb he'd been planning for months, knowing the plan was already bleeding. Rope teams moved forward first because everything depended on lines. The Rangers carried ropes and rope ladders, and they had a specialized trick meant to beat gravity under fire: rocket-fired grapnels. A rocket would scream upward, hauling a steel hook that could bite into the cliff edge and give the first climbers something to trust. It was a simple concept on paper. In salt spray and smoke, with wet rock and enemy hands waiting to cut lines, it was a gamble. A rocket fired and streaked up the face, bright, fast. Then the grapnel clattered down uselessly, scraping stone, finding nothing to catch. Another rocket went up, and the hook caught, the line snapping taut hard it vibrated. Men immediately began climbing it, boots slipping, hands tightening until knuckles went white. The first inches were the hardest. A man had to leave the ocean and commit to rock. He had to lift his weight against gravity and keep moving even as bullets cracked overhead and stone ships popped off the cliff face like angry insects. German defenders had the simplest advantage in warfare: height. They could fire downward. They could throw grenades that bounced and tumbled and detonated where men had nowhere to run. They could cut lines with knives or rifle fire. They could aim at hands. A ranger's palms slid on soaked rope. He clenched harder, rope fibers biting into skin. The rope moved under his weight and burned through the webbing between thumb and forefinger. He didn't let go. Letting go was not falling 10 feet. It was falling until rock and surf and his own gear finished him. All around him, the cliff became a vertical traffic jam of pain and effort. Rifles were slung, muzzles down to keep them from catching on rock. Grenade pouches clinked, canteens banged against hips, helmets scraped stone. Men breathed in short, violent pulls, shoulders cramping, forearms turning into iron. The cliff face offered no kindness. Holds were slick. Some were only finger-width cracks. One man's boot searched for purchase and found nothing but wet limestone. He kicked again, found a nub, and trusted it. His entire body swung out from the cliff as if the earth was trying to shake him off. Below, the surf kept claiming men. A wave hit the base of the cliff and surged around the rocks. A ranger carrying a ladder stumbled. The ladder wrenched sideways and ripped from hands. It drifted for a heartbeat, then the sea took it. Another man tried to pass ammunition forward and dropped a bandolier. It vanished into gray water like it had never existed. Every lost ladder and every lost coil of rope meant fewer men would reach the top. Fewer men meant the Germans would have an easier time isolating the first climbers and killing them before the battalion could build a foothold. Rudder's job was not to climb first. His job was to make sure the climb did not fail. He watched men claw up the cliff under machine gun fire and made decisions with the cold logic of a commander who knew that courage without coordination became casualties without purpose. He forced himself to track where ropes held, where ladders reached, where bodies were piling in the surf. He moved men to reinforce ropes that were taking too much weight. He signaled teams to shift to other lines when a rope started to fray. A rope snapped somewhere to his left. The sound was not dramatic. It was a sharp, sickening twang followed by a scream cut short. A man who had been halfway up suddenly became a falling object. He hit rock, bounced, and disappeared into the surf. The Rangers kept climbing anyway. That was the first truth of Pointe du Hoc. The cliff did not care how brave you were. You climbed because the alternative was dying at the base of it. The first men reached the rim. They crested the top like swimmers breaking the surface after a long dive, gasping, disoriented, desperate for ground. They rolled over the edge and into a moonscape. Pointe du Hoc had been bombarded. The top was cratered so deeply it looked like the earth had been scooped out with giant hands. Concrete bunkers and casements were broken and blackened, some still intact, their firing slits like dead eyes. Barbed wire lay in torn ribbons. The ground reeked of dust and cordite and pulverized limestone. The first Rangers expected to meet the guns. They expected 6 155mm pieces in their emplacements, barrels pointing out toward the sea lanes and the beaches. They expected to run into crews and blast them with grenades and rifle fire, then place charges and thermite and turn the battery into twisted scrap before it could fire. Instead, they found emptiness. Gun pits were there, casements were there. The positions were built to hold artillery, but the guns were not. In their place were telephone poles. Wooden decoys, dark cylindrical shapes meant to be mistaken for gun barrels from aerial reconnaissance, sat where steel should have been. The Rangers stared for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that happens when the mind refuses to accept reality. Then reality caught them by the throat. The climb had been the entry fee. The real mission had just become harder. Rudder's men had two jobs now, both impossible at the same time. They had to hold the point, because abandoning it would allow the Germans to reoccupy the observation point and keep it as a fortress over the beaches. And they had to find the guns, because if the real 155mm pieces were hidden inland, they could still be dragged into action and fire on the invasion force. The battle widened and tightened at once. On the rim, Rangers began clearing trenches and strong points the way infantry always cleared them, with small groups, short distances, and violence measured in seconds. One crater became a foxhole, one trench corner became a death trap. One bunker firing slit became a place where a man could shove in a grenade and a man could count 1001 before the blast thumped through concrete. The environment made everything worse. Crater fields created cover and confusion simultaneously. A man could be 10 yards away and invisible because the terrain folded like a wrinkled sheet. Germans could appear from angles that didn't exist on maps. Rangers could lose each other in the broken earth, shouting names that were swallowed by wind. Small arms engagements here weren't lines and volleys, they were micro-ambushes. A German popped up from a trench and fired point blank. A Ranger fired back without aiming, muzzle flashes in his face, the recoil slamming through his shoulders. A grenade arced over a crater lip, landed, then reality caught them by the throat. The climb had been the entry fee. The real mission had just become harder. Rudder's men had two jobs now, both impossible at the same time. They had to hold the point, because abandoning it would allow the Germans to reoccupy the observation point and keep it as a fortress over the beaches. And they had to find the guns, because if the real 155mm pieces were hidden inland, they could still be dragged into action and fire on the invasion force. The battle widened and tightened at once. On the rim, Rangers began clearing trenches and strong points the way infantry always cleared them, with small groups, short distances, and violence measured in seconds. One crater became a foxhole, one trench corner became a death trap. One bunker firing slit became a place where a man could shove in a grenade and a man could count 1001 before the blast thumped through concrete. The environment made everything worse. Crater fields created cover and confusion simultaneously. A man could be 10 yards away and invisible because the terrain folded like a wrinkled sheet. Germans could appear from angles that didn't exist on maps. Rangers could lose each other in the broken earth, shouting names that were swallowed by wind. Small arms engagements here weren't lines and volleys, they were micro-ambushes. A German popped up from a trench and fired point blank. A Ranger fired back without aiming, muzzle flashes in his face, the recoil slamming through his shoulders. A grenade arced over a crater lip, landed with a clink, and men threw themselves flat, pressing faces into chalk dust while the blast punched the air. The Rangers' tools mattered now. They carried demolition charges meant for guns and casements. They carried thermite grenades, burning compounds hot enough to melt critical metal parts, to fuse mechanisms, to make a gun useless even if the barrel remained intact. Thermite was not infinite. Every grenade and every charge used on a bunker was one less available for the guns they still needed to find. Demolition teams had to make calculations under fire. Is this strong point worth a thermite grenade, or can it be taken with rifle fire and fragmentation? Rudder had to manage the clock. Every minute spent consolidating on the point was a minute the guns could be moved again. He sent men inland. Not a grand advance, not a clean patrol with perfect spacing. A probing movement by small ranger elements, pushing through hedgerows and fields, searching for tracks, for sound, for the logic of German artillery doctrine. Guns don't vanish, they go somewhere that offers concealment and fields of fire. The patrols moved like hunters. They used the bocage, Normandy hedgerows that were both concealment and trap. They listened for metallic clanks, for engine whizzes, for shouted commands in German. They watched for wheel ruts that didn't match farm traffic. They sniffed the air like it could tell them where oil and cordite were. They found the guns about 250 yards inland. 5 155mm pieces sat in a hedgerow area, positioned so they could still be brought into action against the beaches. They were not firing yet. That fact was a mercy and an indictment. The Rangers were late, but not too late. There was no time for perfect demolition. A Ranger ran up to the first gun, breath ragged, rifle slung. He pulled a thermite grenade and threw it onto the breech mechanism. The thermite hissed, then roared. White-hot sparks spat like angry bees. The metal began to glow and then to sag. A mechanism that had been engineered to handle controlled explosions became a puddle of ruined steel. Another gun, another thermite grenade, another burning breech. They disabled 5 guns fast, with the urgency of men who understood that if a single piece fired onto the beaches, it could tear apart landing craft and men in a way no rifleman could stop. They did not have the luxury of making the guns pretty wrecks. They only needed them dead. When the patrol returned to Rudder's perimeter, it brought grim news wrapped in thin relief. The guns were out of action, but the Rangers were now isolated on an exposed point, surrounded by German forces that knew exactly where they were. The Germans counterattacked. It started the way counterattacks often start, probing fire, then movement in small groups, testing the perimeter for weakness. Then the probes turned into pressure. Rudder's Rangers fought from craters and trenches like men defending a shipwreck on a reef. They had no depth, they had no clean resupply. Their positions were improvised and scraped out of bomb-torn earth. A Ranger lay behind a crater lip with his rifle across the edge, cheek pressed into dirt, eyes stinging. He fired at movement in a hedgerow line, short bursts, controlled because ammunition was already becoming a problem. Magazines emptied fast in close fighting. Each reload was a moment of vulnerability, hands fumbling with metal and springs while bullets snapped overhead. Men threw grenades until their arms felt detached from their shoulders. They lobbed them into trenches, into firing slits, into the shadows where Germans clustered. Each explosion kicked up chalk dust that settled on sweat and turned faces gray. German mortars began to range the area. Impacts threw dirt and fragments. Concussion hammered eardrums until the world became muffled, like underwater hearing. A man's ears rang so hard he thought he'd gone deaf. He kept fighting anyway, because fighting did not require hearing as much as it required not giving up. Rudder moved among positions when he could, the way commanders sometimes must, because presence is a kind of ammunition. He spoke briefly, he pointed, he redirected, he absorbed information and turned it into decisions. His battalion was shrinking by the hour. The Rangers had expected relief. They were supposed to be relieved from the beaches, but plans rarely survive first contact with the sea, the enemy, and the tide of chaos that came with the largest amphibious landing in history. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were a spear point that had gone too far ahead, now holding on to the point with fingernails. They needed fire support, and the Navy offshore delivered it. Naval gunfire came in like the hand of a giant. Shells from large guns passed overhead with a low, rising moan that ended in an impact that shook the ground like an earthquake. The shockwave punched through the air and into chests. Dirt jumped, concrete chipped, men felt it through their bones. A destroyer close inshore, USS Satterley, provided direct support, putting shells onto machine gun nests in positions that pinned the Rangers down. The battleship USS Texas contributed heavier bombardment. When those guns fired, it was not a sound so much as a pressure change, as if the atmosphere had flinched. The Rangers used the naval fire like a tool. They called it when they could. They took advantage of its suppressive effect to reposition, to drag wounded men into craters, to reinforce weak points in the perimeter. It was not a magic shield. It did not stop every counterattack, but it forced the Germans to keep their heads down long enough for the Rangers to keep breathing. The cliff assault had been improbable. The hold was worse. This was the compounding nightmare that makes military history honest, a plan that demanded perfection, executed under delay, casualties, and confusion, then punished by a twist no one wanted to believe. They landed late, they lost craft, they climbed wet rock under fire, they fought through fortifications, they found decoys, they still located and disabled 5 155mm guns with thermite, and then they held, isolated, while the enemy tried to crush them back into the sea. Inside the perimeter, the Rangers' numbers dwindled to the point where the battalion became a collection of small groups rather than a coherent formation. Men who had trained to act as companies and platoons now fought as handfuls of survivors. A crater held 3 Rangers and a machine gun. They fired until the barrel grew too hot to touch, then paused, hands shaking, trying to decide if they should move before the next mortar round landed. Another trench segment held 2 men and a radio that barely worked. The radio operator hunched over it, twisting knobs, trying to pull voices out of static, knowing that if communication failed completely, Pointe du Hoc would become a silent pocket to be erased. Leadership became a daily triage. Rudder had to decide whether to concentrate his remaining men to repel the next counterattack, or to keep them spread out enough to prevent infiltration and encirclement. He had to decide how many men could be spared for patrols, for listening posts, for casualty evacuation attempts. He had to decide which wounded could be moved and which could only be made comfortable. The fight did not have one dramatic climax. It had 100 smaller ones. A German squad rushed a trench corner, and a Ranger threw a grenade without standing up, arms snapping forward, the grenade disappearing into shadow. It exploded. The Ranger didn't shear. He reloaded. A machine gun jammed, and a Ranger slapped the receiver, yanked the charging handle, cursed through clenched teeth, and got it running again just as movement appeared in the wire. A man crawled to a wounded buddy under fire, grabbed his web gear, and dragged him backward inch by inch, the wounded man's boots carving lines in chalk dust. This was where the slogan became literal. Rangers lead the way was not a motto on paper here. It was the condition of survival for the beaches behind them. If Pointe du Hoc fell back into German hands with observation intact and guns still a possibility, the beaches would pay. Eventually, relief did come, but not quickly, not cleanly, not as a triumphant parade. It came as additional American forces pushed inland and reconnected with the battered perimeter. It came after the Rangers had been ground down to a fraction of their starting strength. By then, the point was a ruin of bomb craters, shattered concrete, torn wire, and exhausted men who had been living inside their own adrenaline for days. The cost was severe. The 2nd Ranger Battalion's losses on D-Day were devastating. Figures often cited include 77 killed and 152 wounded among those who served in the battalion that day. That number does not mean every casualty happened on the cliff. It reflects the broader D-Day fighting the battalion was involved in. but Pointe du Hoc was the place where the battalion's casualty rate became so high that the survivors could be counted in handfuls rather than companies. Less than 75 of the original 225 who came ashore at Pointe du Hoc were fit for duty after the fighting. That is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is arithmetic applied to trauma. Rudder's own leadership became inseparable from the Ranger legacy. He did not win by keeping everyone alive. No commander could have. He won by keeping the mission alive through the kind of improvisation that doctrine cannot fully teach, adapting when the plan was late, when the ladders were short, when the ropes were cut, when the guns were gone, and when the battalion had to become both assault force and isolated garrison. Pointe du Hoc remains today as proof in concrete and earth. The crater fields still scar the ground. Bunkers still sit with their mouths open toward the sea. The wind still comes in from the channel and finds the same cliff edge the Rangers clawed over at 0710. Grass has grown back, but it grows around holes that were blasted by bombardment and around trenches that once filled with smoke and shouted commands. It is a preserved battlefield landscape, not because it is beautiful, but because it is honest. It shows what happens when a small unit is asked to do something that looks impossible, does it anyway, and then discovers the impossible was only phase 1. The twist at Pointe du Hoc was not merely a clever German deception with telephone poles. The twist was what came after the deception, that the Rangers kept going. They turned a failed expectation into a new mission under fire. They used thermite and willpower to disable the real guns. Then they held ground that every enemy in the area wanted back, with men who were dwindling by the hour. The immediate aftermath was blood in craters, salt on torn uniforms, medics working with scarce supplies, and men who slept where they fell because exhaustion finally beat adrenaline. Recognition followed in the ways the military knows: citations, unit legacy, and the hard memory of a place name that becomes shorthand for a type of courage. Post-war life for the survivors carried what combat always carries forward: injuries, nightmares, silence, and the strange dislocation of returning to a world where most people could not imagine climbing 100-foot cliff under fire and then fighting for days with no clean escape. Modern legacy is written into the landscape itself. Pointe du Hoc stands between Omaha and Utah as a reminder that D-Day was not a single beach or a single hour. It was a web of missions, many of them dependent on small groups doing brutal work out of sight of the main narrative. The Rangers' cratered promontory is one of those places where history can still be walked and where the wind still sounds like surf climbing a cliff. These men deserve to be remembered.